If you are getting progressively stronger at your lifts, you are training with enough volume. Hey everybody, I thought I would chat with you guys and gals a little bit about this today. This is one of these things that comes up a lot, with the volume conversations. And this always comes back to my point about the progressive overload in the chicken or the egg. I am one of those people that even though I push progressive overload, I discuss it heavily, it's a huge deal, I actually generally tend to be in the direction of progressive overload is evidence that you have stimulated proper adaptation, right? It's evidence that you are gaining muscle. I don't actually always think it is the primary driver. Yes, mechanical tension is the driver, but that is at the individual fiber level. So, these topics come up of how much volume we need, and people will argue about volume. And here's the thing that I will say, and this, again, in the context of progressive overload, using good form and not cheating and all of that. Because otherwise you can fake progressive overload. Obviously you can do cheat reps and things and convince yourself that you're progressing when the muscles themselves really aren't. But generally speaking, if you are making some progress, any progress whatsoever on your lifts, you're doing enough training volume. Okay? You are probably doing enough training volume. And because that happens at a fairly low level, here's the thing I'm going to say. If you have added a ton of training volume and you're not seeing any progress, adding more volume is absolutely not going to be the solution. It's not going to be the solution. And I'm not saying high volumes of training don't have their place. I'm not saying they can't work. I'm not saying not to do them. Again, let's be extremely clear when we make that statement. Higher volumes of training absolutely have their place for maximizing hypertrophy, particularly when you're chasing that last little tiny bit. Okay? But they never are required to make gains. And here's what I'm going to say with that again. If you are seeing progress, you probably have enough training volume to gain muscle. Okay? Now, am I saying sometimes adding some more won't help? No, it can sometimes, absolutely can. But, in this context, if you're able to add reps with the same weight, and it doesn't have to be weekly, I'm talking about even over time. Keep in mind this scales with experience level. But if you're seeing progress, you know that you're doing enough volume to see muscle growth. You know that you're doing enough volume. So again, one of these topics where people say, well, how do I know that I'm doing enough volume? Well, are you training hard enough, first of all? Because a lot of times if you're just trying to add volume because you're not training hard enough, the other solution is to train harder. Okay, that's the solution. Now, can you add volume and not train harder and make progress? Sure, and I think that's why we see these studies that show that, because these people aren't training that hard, and so therefore they need 20 sets to really see good progress in muscle growth, or not necessarily to see good progress, because you'll have these volume studies where they make a little more progress. But it's not like the people doing 6 or 10 sets a week aren't making any progress, unless they're just not training hard at all. Right? So it's usually what's happening though is they see a little more, but as those studies go up, sometimes it's the cases of the people who are doing the 30 sets a week is because they really are training lazy. And therefore that extra volume is finally creating enough fatigue in the later sets to really get muscle growth, because they just quite frankly are not pushing themselves enough to really stimulate adaptations and hypertrophy with the early sets. Okay, but in that case, is it the lack of volume that's the problem, or is it the lack of reaching all the upper threshold muscle fibers? Okay, that's the case of what's going on. But in that case, it's because everything is a warm-up, meaning they're having to do jump volume to even get through the warm-ups. If your first 6 work sets are warm-ups, or your first 10 sets for a muscle per week, well, yeah, obviously you're going to need a lot of training volume. But let's come over and look at it from the other perspective. If you're able to progress, if you are adding weights, at least, periodically, If you're adding weight or you're adding reps, your training volumes are probably sufficient, particularly if it's through your entire body. Okay? And it doesn't mean that's always going to happen on your small isolation movements because, again, quite frankly, a 15 rep set of curls it's not a heavy weight. So even adding 5 pounds to something like that could take you a year. Okay, it literally could, or more. But when we're talking about movements to where there's a substantial amount of weight, to where 2 pounds or 5 pounds or whatever is not a large percentage of the weight being used, right? Like if you have 400 pounds on the bar already for 10 reps, okay, we should be able to see some small improvements there. But also keep in mind this scales for experience level, and people do have to remember that. You have to look at, are you making progress that's consistent with your level of experience? Obviously, if you've been training hard for 5 or 6 years, progress is going to go very, very slow. Okay, but the other thing to think about, particularly in those cases, what happens when you start to regress? Well, are you cutting? Did you lose weight? Well, that would explain it. But if you're not, let's say you're staying at the same weight and you start to regress instead of making progress, I would almost say that's probably a recovery issue. Because if you're regressing and you're doing those hard sets, like, man, I'm doing sets to failure and they're getting weaker, well, then you're training hard enough. So if you start regressing at that point, it could be a case of your frequency or volume is too high, or your other recovery factors are not in place. You're not recovering. So that's the other way to look at it. It's not just, are you doing enough volume? Okay. The other question then becomes, are you recovering? Because that's always the other end of the equation. All right. We don't have just limitless recovery ability, and I'm not saying we overtrain always easily, but there does come a point where training stimulus itself is getting reduced due to too much volume. But here's a good rule of thumb to always remember, and people have to always remember that. If you are making progress, if you are adding weight or adding reps regularly, you are clearly doing something right. Okay? You are clearly doing something right. And if it's not broke, don't fix it. Again, barring the case of, are you getting inflammation, are you getting injuries, are you getting aches and pains? Well, you may want to adjust in that case. But barring that, if we are seeing progress, your training volumes are probably pretty good. They're probably sufficient for what you're trying to do. You clearly have something dialed in okay, and you should just continue to run with it. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I'll talk to you guys and gals next time.